You open your phone, there's a notification about your ballot. Wait, is it even coming this year? For millions of Americans right now, that's not a hypothetical question. It's this week's headline. And what's actually happening behind that headline is bigger, messier, and a lot more consequential than any single alert on your lock screen can explain. So let's slow down, let's actually walk through it. Back in March, President Trump signed an executive order aimed at limiting mail-in voting ahead of this November's midterm elections. The stated reason was election security, specifically, stopping illegal voting by non-citizens. Sounds simple enough, right? Here's the thing, though. Multiple independent studies and government audits have found that kind of fraud is exceptionally rare in the United States. Rare, but not zero. So why does one executive order feel like it's reopening an old wound? That gap, between how common the problem actually is and how urgently the order treats it, is where this entire fight begins. To understand why this landed so hard, you have to remember where mail voting sits in the country's recent political memory. Mail-in ballots surged during the 2020 election, mostly out of public health necessity, and they've been a flashpoint in American politics ever since. Some states leaned into that shift and made mail voting easier and more permanent. Others pulled back, tightening rules and adding new verification steps. This executive order didn't create that divide. It landed directly on top of one that already existed, which is part of why it triggered such an immediate, intense reaction. 25 Democratic state attorneys general pushed back almost immediately. New York's Letitia James led the charge. Their argument was straightforward. The Constitution gives states, not the federal government, primary control over how their own elections are run. A federal judge in Boston named Indira Talwani, an appointee of President Obama, largely agreed with them. Twice. First, back in June, she blocked the order for 23 mostly Democratic-led states plus Washington, D.C. Then she went further, issuing a nationwide block that stopped the U.S. Postal Service from doing any work at all to carry out Trump's directive. So did that settle it? That's where things got complicated. Earlier this week, the Supreme Court stepped into the fight. It's important to be precise about what they actually decided because a lot of headlines blurred this. Did the justices side with Trump? Not exactly. The justices did not rule on whether Trump's order is legal. That bigger question is still completely open. What they ruled on was narrower, a procedural technicality. They said Judge Talwani had acted too early, before the Postal Service had even finalized the specific rule it planned to use to carry out the order. In other words, right result, wrong timing, according to the court. So the Postal Service went and finalized it. And what's actually inside that rule? On August 21st, USPS released its official rule. Under it, mail ballots would only be delivered to voters on official absentee lists that states would now be required to hand over to a federal agency. Tucked inside that rule was something else, too. Language touching a decades-old federal protection that bars most states from purging their voter rolls within 90 days of an election. Republicans are now pushing courts to reinterpret that long-standing rule. Then, on Wednesday, Judge Talwani did something that surprised a lot of election law watchers. She canceled her own nationwide block, for now. But why does that one small phrase, for now, matter so much? Here's why it's doing so much heavy lifting in this story. The first mail ballots for this year's midterms are scheduled to go out next week. Not next month. Next week. Which means whatever rules are technically in effect at this exact moment are the rules that millions of real voters are about to experience, whether the underlying legal fight is settled or not. Just sit with what that means logistically for a second. Election officials across dozens of states have spent months preparing ballots, mailing systems, and voter outreach under one set of assumptions. Now, days before printing deadlines, they're being told those assumptions could shift again, possibly more than once, before a single ballot lands in a mailbox. Letitia James didn't soften her reaction. She's characterized the timing as the federal government reaching into state-run elections at the worst possible moment, with the clock already running. Voting rights organizations have raised similar alarms, warning that older voters, military families stationed overseas, and people with disabilities groups that rely on mail voting more heavily than the general population, are the most likely to get caught in any confusion. And this isn't a small slice of the electorate we're talking about. Tens of millions of Americans now vote by mail every election cycle, a habit that only grew after 2020 and never fully receded. Control of Congress in this year's midterms is expected to come down to a relatively small number of competitive districts and states, many of which lean heavily on mail voting. Which means a rule change affecting even a modest percentage of mailed ballots could realistically shift the outcome in races that decide which party controls the House or the Senate for the next 2 years. And there's a detail in this story that keeps showing up in the conversation around it, because it complicates the narrative in an interesting way. Trump himself has voted by mail before, from Florida. Critics point to that as evidence the order isn't really about mail voting itself. Supporters counter that the order was never designed to ban mail voting at all. It's designed, they say, to verify who is legitimately eligible to use it. Which side you find more convincing probably depends on which value you weigh more heavily to begin with. So who's actually right here? Is this really about security, or is it really about access? Honestly, that's not a question with one clean answer, because it depends on which underlying value you prioritize: election security or election access. And thoughtful, well-informed people land in genuinely different places on that trade-off. Supporters of the order argue that any system handling tens of millions of mailed ballots needs airtight verification before problems happen, not after. From that view, requiring states to share absentee voter lists with USPS isn't an obstacle. It's a basic safeguard, the same kind of list checking that already happens in other parts of election administration. They see Trump's March order as closing a loophole before it can be exploited, even if exploitation has been rare so far. Critics argue there's no evidence of a fraud problem large enough to justify this scale of last-minute change. They point to the same studies showing non-citizen voting is exceptionally uncommon. And they warn that abrupt rule shifts this close to an election tend to suppress legitimate turnout far more than they prevent fraud, especially among voters who depend on mail ballots specifically, because getting to a polling place in person is difficult or impossible for them. Underneath both arguments sits a quieter, older fight: who actually gets to control how American elections are run? The Constitution grants states substantial authority over their own election administration, but it doesn't settle every boundary question, especially when a federal agency like the Postal Service gets pulled into the machinery. This case, more than almost any other in recent memory, is forcing courts to draw that line more clearly than it's ever been drawn before. But is there a piece of this story almost nobody's talking about? There's also something worth noticing about the Postal Service itself here. For most of its history, USPS has tried hard to stay out of partisan fights entirely. It's the agency that delivers everyone's mail, regardless of who they voted for. Being pulled directly into the middle of a contested executive order, forced to write rules that determine whose ballot gets delivered and whose might not, is a fairly unusual position for it to be in. Some career postal officials and outside election administrators have quietly noted that this puts the agency's reputation for neutrality at real risk, no matter which side ultimately wins the legal fight. And here's the part that's easy to miss in all the noise. This fight is not over, not close. Judge Talwani only lifted her nationwide block this week. She still hasn't ruled on whether Trump's order is actually legal under the Constitution. A brand new lawsuit from Democratic state officials landed within hours of her decision. Given how this has gone so far, it's very likely this ends up back at the Supreme Court, this time arguing the actual merits of the case, not just procedure. There's one more layer worth understanding before we get to what this means for you directly. Legal experts who watch election law closely point out that, for now, rulings like Judge Talwani's are becoming more common in high-profile political cases generally, not just this one. Courts increasingly issue narrow, temporary decisions that resolve the immediate emergency without settling the underlying dispute, often because the full case simply hasn't had time to move through normal proceedings. The effect, intentional or not, is that voters, election officials, and candidates are left operating under rules that could still change again before Election Day, sometimes more than once. So what does any of this mean for you, practically, if you vote by mail? If you live in one of the states involved in this lawsuit, don't assume your usual ballot timeline still applies. Check your state election office's website directly, and check it again closer to your state's mailing date, because the rules on the ground can shift with very little public notice right now. That's genuinely frustrating for voters trying to plan ahead. It's also just the reality this particular week. If you're registered to vote absentee, make sure your registration and your mailing address are current today, not sometime in October, when it might be too late to fix. Whatever list your state hands over to USPS will be built from whatever information is currently on file. An outdated address isn't a small clerical issue anymore. It could genuinely be the difference between your ballot arriving and it not arriving at all. If you're not sure whether your state is one of the 25 involved in this lawsuit, that's worth 5 minutes of searching before you assume anything either way. It's a small task, but it's the kind of small task that actually matters this particular election cycle, in a way it might not in a calmer year. And if you've ever felt like the technical mechanics of voting are too boring or too bureaucratic to pay attention to, this is the story that quietly proves otherwise. Absentee voter lists, 90-day purge windows, a procedural Supreme Court ruling that never even touched the actual legal question. This is exactly where elections get shaped, long before anyone actually steps up to cast a vote or drops a ballot in the mail. It rarely makes for a dramatic headline on its own, which is exactly why it so often goes unnoticed, until a week like this one forces everyone to pay attention at once. You open your phone, there's a notification about your ballot. This time, you actually understand why it's there, and why, for millions of people across the country, whether it arrives at all just became a question worth asking.